morning, everyone.
And welcome to the Conn Maciel Carey 2025 Cal OSHA webinar series. And today we are going to be discussing top strategies for reviewing your safety program. I am Rachel Conn. I am chair of the California practice, and I am joined today by my California partner, Megan Shaked, and our senior counsel, Andrea Chavez. For those of you that don't know me, I'm a partner and chair of the practice here in California, and I am based in our San Francisco office, and I do everything OSHA and Cal OSHA related, from compliance to litigation, as well as rulemaking. And myself, along with Andrea Chavez, we joined the firm a couple years ago from Nixon Peabody, where I ran their national OSHA practice. I'm also joined by Megan Shaked, who's a partner in our San Francisco office as well, in both our workplace safety and employment law practices, and Andrea Chavez, who is in our Los Angeles office and also senior counsel in both workplace safety and our labor and employment practice. So as you can see, we have the full state covered. And our agenda today, we're going to start off with the importance of reviewing your safety program, the top violations and hazards, and how that can dictate how you review your safety program, review of those program documents, and of course, reviewing the effectiveness of your program. And with that, I will turn it over to Megan to get us started.
Thanks, Rachel. So we first want to set the stage for the importance of reviewing your safety program as we get into some of the details. So kind of two questions come to mind when we talk about this topic. The first is your safety program compliant? And the things that we want folks looking at on this to answer this question is, what does the regulation require, and are there any updates you need to bring it into compliance with the regulatory requirements? And then operationally, is it also, working in terms of practice? We often hear, the program looks great on paper, but is it working on the ground? So that's another thing to keep in mind. And what you're looking at when you're trying to answer is whether the program is compliant. You're, of course, looking at the program documents themselves to make sure it has, the requisite sections, all of the detail that's required to be in it from the specific regulations. And then, are the procedures themselves compliant too? Do they, have enough detail? Are they workable? Are they actually being used to ensure that the program is doing what the program documents say it does? The other things that, it's always good to review when you're answering whether your program is compliant is, are there specific requirements or specific details that apply to a given work site? And do those match what the program document says? Is that's what's happening in practice? Or is there a mismatch between what the program document says and what's actually happening on the ground? And then, as you review a program, it's always an opportunity to look out for if there are new hazards that need to be addressed, new processes that might be in place, or new equipment that might be used that needs to be updated since the last time a program may have been reviewed. So then, once you kind of review whether the program itself is in line with what the regulations require, you have to also think about whether the program is working as designed. And the things we look at here is, the intention of a safety program. One of the key goals is preventing injuries and illnesses. So is that happening, or is there some disconnect between the program and, incidents that are occurring, and are there ways to adjust? I mentioned if the practices match the program. This is a really good way to test whether the program is working. If the program document calls for certain steps to be in place, is that actually happening? For example, in your heat illness prevention program, let's say it calls out a specific method for replenishing your supply of water. Is that actually the process that's being followed, or perhaps is some other process being followed? And does there need to be a matching of that? Another thing we really look at is how strong is the safety culture? Is this kind of embedded in everyone's day to day work practices? Or is this something that is, kind of difficult to put those pieces of the puzzle together? Or, do you see employees really incorporating the requirements into their day to day habits? And of course, asking the question, is there room for improvement? And at the end of the day, what we're looking for is, of course, reduction or elimination of prevention of injuries and illnesses in the workplace. And that can have a vast array of benefits, including the things you see at the bottom of the slide: reduced costs, reduced liability, productivity, and happy employees who stay and are retained in their positions. And then the third kind of category of thing to think about as we're going through the presentation today is your approach to the review of your safety program, and whether it's going to be kind of a proactive approach or a reactive approach. And the reality is it's probably going to be some of both. What is often a good example of a way to review your safety program just comes out naturally. Safety program is often tested during an inspection, and that can be a programmed inspection. Your number is just pulled in the lottery of periodic inspections that the agency performs, or it could be driven by a complaint or an incident. In any event, being really prepared for an inspection is a natural way to test your safety program and prepare for inspections at the same time. And the things to think about when you're, thinking about review of your program in the context of a potential or actual on-site inspection are thinking through the steps that the agency themselves will be taking, and how they will be evaluating your program. So, it often starts with an unannounced arrival of an inspector at your site, and they will walk around your site and have an opportunity to see things in action. So, kind of thinking through that as you're reviewing your program. How is this going to look for somebody who's coming from the outside and is going to be evaluating our program? Second thing to keep in mind is that the inspector often has the opportunity to interview both management and non-management folks. And they're likely to ask specific questions about individual programs, about equipment that's being used, about processes that are in place. They even get into details about how they're supervised or what specific training they have been provided with, and are sometimes asked very, very specific questions about regulatory requirements. And sometimes, what we refer to as a requirement might not be the same language that employees who are, working day in and day out are more familiar with. So understanding that the inspector might use, particular terms of art that your folks on the ground might not be as familiar with. And how are you going to make sure that, the program is understood by your employees in a similar way that an inspector might be reviewing it? And then, of course, inspectors leave document requests with employers. So they're going to be reviewing the actual document, the program documents itself, and oftentimes supporting documents as well. And then the last thing we kind of want you to keep in mind in the back of your mind as we're going through this is, if there's any other considerations in reviewing your safety program, any other factors that might come into play in how your program is working. And the things we think about are kind of employee and union relations. If there's anything particular about your workforce that impacts how you present your safety program, how you review and revise your safety program, how you train folks on your safety program. And then also kind of think about the potential for increased stakes in a review of your safety program. These sometimes come up when there's a serious injury or fatality, or there are other folks involved beyond, just kind of a regular Cal OSHA inspection. For fatality inspections, the Bureau of Investigation may be involved and be taking a second and more critical review of your safety program, or there might be third-party litigation at stake, where people even outside of Cal OSHA may be reviewing your documents and your program as well. And with that, Andrea is going to talk about some other factors to consider.
Thank you, Megan. I will be discussing the importance of reviewing Cal OSHA in your workplace's top violations and hazards. So as you revisit your safety programs, it's helpful to focus on Cal OSHA's most frequently cited standards. And Cal OSHA publishes this data on its website to alert employers to common hazards so they can proactively identify and correct issues in their workplace. The goal is to prevent workplace injuries and illnesses and ideally avoid inspections. Many of these violations are really considered low-hanging fruit. They may not always represent high hazard conditions, but basic requirements that are easily overlooked by employers. That's why this list is really important. It's a standard. If a standard is frequently cited, it often means it's something Cal OSHA regularly checks during their investigations. It's easy for employers to fall out of compliance, and it carries a higher risk of repeat violations, which can trigger more serious enforcement actions or higher penalties. So when you review the top 10 violations, really think about what areas, Cal OSHA is heavily focused on right now, which may affect your specific business, and what compliance gaps are easily missed, but also easily fixed. It's important that Conn Maciel standards that are applicable to you are part of your audit protocols and incorporated also into your periodic inspection checklists. So what you see here, these are some public resources that are helpful to track trends, and we just listed them here for your review. So according to the 10-year trend data from Cal OSHA, the number of complaints have really stayed essentially stable over the past 4 to 5 years. We did see in 2024 a decrease in citations issued, even though the volume of complaints really remained steady. And this may be due to staffing constraints. We also saw a slight decrease in serious and willful and repeat citations. Initial penalty amounts stay consistent, but as you see here, the current penalty totals has increased, or it's showing as an increase, but this is likely just because these citations are still under appeal and being negotiated. Next slide. So looking at the inspection types, what's interesting is that we saw a slight increase in programmed inspections, and this is possibly due to staffing increases in specialized units like process safety management, PSM. So if you are an industry subject to things like PSM or other units that do programmed inspections, it's just good to keep this in mind that Cal OSHA seems to be more focused now on programmed inspections. So we do have some data from 2025. The Q1 data is shown here. This shows the type of inspections by industry. There's no surprise that construction is leading in the number of inspections, followed by manufacturing. These industries also have the most programmed inspections. So again, if you are in these industries, it's extra important to review your safety programs regularly and stay in compliance, both with your written programs and on the ground. We also saw an increase in agricultural inspections, even though the actual number of violations did not increase. And finally, we have the list of the top 10 violations for 2024. And I am not going to go over these in detail because we just did a webinar that you can find on our website or on YouTube. in which we go into each of these in depth. But I do want to note again that these do not always represent high hazard conditions, but rather more basic requirements that are often overlooked, which Cal OSHA tends to focus on in each investigation. So for example, we see Cal OSHA request employers IPPs, HAZCOM programs, and now heat illness programs in essentially every inspection, regardless of the type of inspection. So it's really important to review those policies to ensure compliance. I also want to note that some of the top standards, especially as you see here, these top 3 are unique to California. For the other ones, Fed OSHA has a similar standard. So if you are a national employer, be aware of the differences between the Cal OSHA and Fed OSHA standards. And even though they are similar, Cal OSHA typically has slightly different requirements and more robust requirements. So again, this is just the top 10 most frequently cited standards by Cal OSHA. Okay, so another thing to consider are the special emphasis programs, which address specific high hazard industries, operations, and safety issues in workplaces. They involve target inspections, compliance assistance, and outreach. As review of the programs will give you an idea of how Cal OSHA plans to plans to respond to complaints, the timing of the response, and other important insights. So for example, the heat illness emphasis program outlines how inspectors should determine whether heat illness or heat was a contributing factor to an employee's illness. It also gives insight into the focus of Cal OSHA inspections. So again, the heat illness emphasis program states that inspections will primarily be focused on agriculture, construction, and landscaping activities. And that 1 out of every 5 sites that appear to be in compliance must also be investigated. So it's just important to know if you are subject to an emphasis program because you may be a focus for Cal OSHA. It's also important to keep up to date on new laws and regulations and also what's in the pipeline so that you are in compliance once they go into effect, because there's also often no grace period for enforcement. And even though it seems like Cal OSHA just adopted its indoor heat regulation, in May of this year, it released a draft proposal to revise the regulation. It also released draft revisions to the outdoor heat standard and wildfire smoke standard. Also, don't get too comfortable with your current workplace violence programs because Cal OSHA has to adopt its own regulation by the end of 2026 and has already published its 2nd draft of that regulation. So again, try to just keep on top of Cal OSHA developments and what has been adopted, because often you'll have to start revising your programs before the regulations become effective. And one of the most effective ways to strengthen your company's safety program is to thoroughly review hazards that are specific to your workplace, especially those that result in injury and illnesses. So a review of your OSHA records, specifically things like your 300 log, 301 forms, employers' reports can tell you a lot. Really look for patterns in injuries and illnesses. For example, are the same types of incidents happening over and over again? Are there certain departments or tasks which are consistently involved in the injury and illnesses? Those type of things are red flags. Also, examine your disciplinary records. These may reveal safety-related violations, like improper use of equipment or failure to provide to follow procedures. And if you're seeing, again, the same thing over and over, it might not just be the behavior of one individual. It might indicate gaps in training or unsafe practices. And you should also review employee complaints and near miss reports. And these are really like your first line of defense, because workers tend to identify hazards before they result in actual injuries. But you have to be tracking and responding to those concerns and complaints on like a more high level basis to take real meaningful action. And so once you have this information, once you have this data, you should use it to identify high risk areas in your workplace or high risk tasks and abate to the extent possible. You should also use it to prioritize your training efforts and update your written programs like your IAPP and update your hazard assessments to ensure, if your hazard assessments, they should be updated to ensure that you're checking for the hazards that you identified in your workplace and the abatement that you have implemented. And finally, you just generally want to try to improve your workplace safety culture and compliance. With that, I will turn it over to Megan.
Thanks, Andrea. Okay, so reviewing program documents, we're going to get into a little bit more detail on some things that you can consider doing when you're sitting down and reviewing your program, or kind of along the way as your program is being used. So the first kind of question is going through the required elements. This is like actually looking at the regulatory language and making sure that you've addressed the requirements. And one thing we sometimes see is that while employers are certainly free to write their program documents in the way that makes sense to them, the agencies are often doing a check the box exercise for elements that are in the regulation to see if they're in your program document. So particularly for regulatory requirements that are quite extensive and quite detailed, like the injury and illness prevention requirement, the heat illness prevention requirements, and the workplace violence prevention program requirements, that you want to make sure that each kind of subsection of requirement, for example, periodic inspections or training or different categories, are all addressed in your program, and that they're organized in a way that's easy for the folks who are subject to them to apply, and also easy for somebody to check to make sure that they're in compliance. Another category is sometimes employers are, and they're free to do this, have requirements above and beyond what's required in the regulation. So key question is, if an employer is adding additional requirements or putting in, kind of adding flesh to the bones, adding more details beyond the regulatory language, are those being followed? Because the agency will expect, if you add above and beyond what's required, or you have specific requirements in your program document, that those are actually being followed. So you want to check for that. On the next slide, you want to think through, does this program make sense for our actual operations? It's common for us to see form program documents floating out there that are provided by insurance providers or that are, available for free on the internet. And that form may not apply to a given industry or a specific operation or a specific work site. So checking to make sure that your program makes sense for you as the employer, makes sense for your operations, and makes sense for your specific work site. It may need to be specialized or customized for given departments or operations or certain locations. Certainly, if you are using kind of a template or a form that calls for filling in specific information, perhaps a specific position at a given work site who's responsible for the program, or specific information about, let's say, your workplace violence program, references a specific emergency action plan that applies to a given work site, making sure those details and any blanks are filled in, actually filling in those blanks, and making sure that any required customization is done as well. On the next slide, continuing, some safety programs have been built over time. You may start out with certain core documents, and then you may end up with additional documents that go along with it. For example, in the workplace violence program, you may already have an existing, risk management plan or emergency action plan, and perhaps your workplace violence plan references other existing programs. So checking to make sure any internal references amongst safety programs, individual safety programs, are speaking to each other in a consistent way. And if there are overlapping programs and overlapping requirements, that those are consistent as well. If the emergency action plan calls for certain actions to be taken in certain events, and a similar reference is in your workplace violence plan, making sure those are consistent. And the way that I think about it, practically speaking, is that you really want your folks on the ground to understand what to do in certain circumstances, and you want to make sure there's no confusion. And then coordinating with other teams if necessary. Some program documents are clearly owned by safety and executed by safety, and perhaps that there's nobody else to coordinate with. But again, taking workplace violence as an example, sometimes things have to be coordinated with other folks, HR or security folks or other people, and making sure that any of that coordination is happening as well. Again, to make sure that folks who are following the program, who are enforcing the program, who are executing on the program, know exactly what to do. And then we'll talk about this a little bit later on, but also tracking any regulatory requirements in terms of periodic review or periodic inspections or periodic training. A lot of programs are not just one and done, where you finish the program document, you implement them, and then you walk away and you don't have anything further to do. A lot of regulatory requirements are very specific on this, and you want to make sure you're tracking that. And then again, making sure that if you have, a required document, the underlying program document, and then you have documents that may support that document. For example, in injury and illness prevention, if you have your program document and then you have, a form periodic inspection checklist, or you have a safe practices guide for specific tasks, making sure that all of that is working well with one another. And I'll pass to Rachel for the next section.
Thank you, Megan. Now we're going to get into reviewing program effectiveness. As Andrea went through, what may be some of the specific trends and things for your industries and what things Cal OSHA is focusing on. Of course, those are really great areas to, include in your program review. And as Megan was discussing, reviewing those program documents, we know that that's the first kind of level of review, and certainly the first level of review that we are going to see from Cal OSHA. Now, in terms of reviewing program effectiveness, this is particularly important here in California from a Cal OSHA liability perspective, in the sense that, of course, out here we have the Injury and Illness Prevention Program regulation. And if you have facilities here, I assume you do, you're on this call, and you've ever had a Cal OSHA inspection, you may have been subject to a Cal OSHA citation for not that maybe your program, not that you didn't have a program, and not that you didn't have all the requirements of the program, but the citation may read something like, your program or your procedure was not effective. So Cal OSHA really uses the IIPP regulation as a way to test and to push on employers' program effectiveness. So even more so than what we see in other jurisdictions, here in California, that really serves as a mechanism for Cal OSHA to really evaluate that. And so when you are reviewing your safety programs, part of that is reviewing this effectiveness. This, is it operationally working? You know, we talked a lot about this with workplace violence prevention programs, and Megan talked a lot about this in the previous section of, we can write beautiful programs that on the paper are you know, hit all the requirements, and we think address the hazards, but are they effective? Are the programs talking to each other? Have we included the right parties? I can't tell you how many times when I was working with a company while they were writing their workplace violence prevention program, that they would say, well, the procedure for doing this is going to be, you know, HR is going to do it, and then it's going to go to security. And then you talk to HR, and HR says, we that's not what our function is. We don't do that, or we don't do this. So that's to say that you can write beautiful procedures, but if they don't actually work as intended, they're not going to be effective. So reviewing program effectiveness, and, you know, Cal OSHA regulations in particular, and several OSHA regulations already have, as built in part of their regulations, opportunities to do that if you're utilizing them in the way that they are written. So periodic inspections, and we see that within several Cal OSHA regulations, already built in the mechanisms to do that. So periodic inspections of your workplace in a variety of ways should already be a part of your safety program, and that should already be one of the number one mechanisms to use to ensure that your program is effective. And that's, of course, if you are, you know, using those inspections as an opportunity to do that, and if you don't have health and safety personnel on the ground that are the ones that are able to carry those out, are you training your managers or supervisors or whoever on the site is available to do it? Are you training them to not only just, when they review and do these inspections, to kind of not just check the boxes, but really think through what it is that they're looking for? Are there things that they see are hazards that aren't on these lists that need to be updated? I think, as Megan mentioned in her section, you know, a lot of these documents are what I consider fluid, in the sense that it's not one and done. And, you know, again, a great example of that is something like your workplace violence prevention program, where you may write these beautiful programs, but once you start to get in the practice of it, you may see that certain procedures, certain ways of reporting or doing investigations need to be tweaked. And that's built into that program because it requires a review anytime that you have an incident. So that's to say that if we have these regulations in place that require all of these things, make sure that you're really utilizing them as opportunities to review the effectiveness of the program, and not just as, you know, this is something that we are required to do and to kind of check the box. So we'll talk about some of the different types of periodic inspections that are required by the Cal OSHA regulations in particular in a minute, and how to utilize those. But also, certain regulations have program reviews as well. So ensuring that you know which programs require reviews and at what cadence, and making sure that that gets done. That is certainly a gap that I see when I work with employers, is that there is a lack of doing those program reviews when they are required. And I certainly know that, safety teams are incredibly busy, and that may not be the highest priority on the list of things to do, but it's certainly something to keep on the radar. And one of the things that I have found to be helpful is, especially if you have several sites where you may have individual safety and personnel on the site, or you may have other folks on the site that are going to be responsible for that, having an outline for them of what the cadence is for each program review. Because unless you call it out and say this program needs to be reviewed annually, it's usually not going to get done. So that's a good way of putting a tracker together about when these program reviews take place. Another great way of reviewing program effectiveness is audits. Auditing your workplace. We've talked a lot about program reviews, but as we know, program reviews are only, part of the process. The audits of what is actually happening on the ground in your facilities are incredibly important to, identify any additional hazards that may not have been previously identified, and to ensure that the programs you have in place are functioning operationally. And we'll talk about doing those audits, whether or not you want to do those internally, whether or not you want to bring in outside counsel like ourselves to help do that under privilege, and what the pros and cons are that. But we find that privileged audits can be a very great way of reviewing the effectiveness of your programs, identifying new hazards without opening you up to the liability of, let's say, as part of the audit, you identify several new hazards, and it may take additional time. You have to go through additional routes to get the resources to do those things, and we know that all of that stuff takes time to correct. And going through the privilege audit process allows you the ability to go through those processes without the fear that if Cal OSHA comes in to inspect, you have to give them all of these documents with uncorrected hazards identified. And of course, accident investigations is a way of reviewing your program effectiveness. As Megan mentioned, that's proactive versus reactive. Of course, accident investigations are part of a reactive approach. But if you have an unfortunate situation where an accident does occur, this is the time where you can use these reports and investigations as part of reviewing the effectiveness of those programs. And, reviewing all of your other OSHA documents that may contain some additional trends on that program effectiveness. So I'll start with, the kind of the catch-all, the main show, as I would say, in terms of periodic inspections in California, which is your injury and illness prevention program. So this is going to be the cornerstone of your safety program in California. It's going to be the cornerstone of your inspections for the most part, unless you kind of have a more robust program outside of that, which some employers do. But this is going to be kind of the key component and the key area that you can use to push on the effectiveness of your program. So the IIPP regulation requires you to include any procedures for identifying and evaluating workplace hazards, and that is through scheduled and periodic inspections to identify unsafe conditions. And these inspections shall be made to identify and evaluate hazards. And these inspections occur when the program's first established, whenever new substances, processes, and procedures or equipment are introduced into the workplace, and when an employer is made aware of new or previously unrecognized hazards. So you have scheduled, and you're going to have periodic inspections that you can use as the tool on the ground. This isn't going to be part of your written review that Megan was talking about. This is going to be your on the ground review of those hazards. Most folks, you have your checklist that you're going to go through. One of the main things, though, that I see that employers do not do in this process, and again, it goes back to ensuring that this is fluid, is that updating those checklists when we do identify additional hazards, that's going to be part of ensuring that these types of inspections are effective. And then changing the cadence of periodic inspections when necessary. So if you're seeing an increase in events, in accidents, you want to make sure that you are upping the amount of times that you're doing these periodic inspections. There is not a prescribed amount of what periodic inspections mean. So that's really up to you as the employer to gauge what that workplace needs and to adjust accordingly. But this is one of the number one ways that you can really dig into the workplace on the ground outside of that program review. And one of the biggest parts of the program review is making sure that you're also properly doing the record keeping of it. So you're going to make sure that you are including the persons that conducted the inspection, what was identified, and the corrective actions that you're going to take. And that is a big piece of where I see employers kind of get off the tracks in terms of these types of inspections. Is there's not the follow-up. They may go through the inspection checklist and list all this information, identify it, the person on the ground may do it, but then the action taken, the corrective action isn't updated and isn't listed on these forms. And that's an area where you need to make sure that your managers and your supervisors on the ground are trained to know that that is part of the process. It is a critical part of the process, and it needs to be documented appropriately. And these records shall be maintained for at least 1 year. And as a side note, this is very low-hanging fruit for Cal OSHA. So if you are not documenting these and not retaining these records, that is an easy citation for them, and that is an easy repeat citation as well. So certainly make sure that you are documenting these appropriately. And that's not only important from a compliance standpoint, but important from an effectiveness of your program standpoint. Lockout, tagout, again, another area that has that built-in periodic inspection. So the employer shall conduct the periodic inspection of your energy procedures at least annually to evaluate their continued effectiveness to determine the necessity for updating the written procedures. The periodic inspection shall be performed by authorized persons other than the ones utilizing the hazardous energy procedures being inspected, and where lockout and tagout is used for hazard control, the periodic inspection shall include a review between the inspector and authorized employees of their responsibilities under the hazard energy control procedure being inspected. This is one that I see that is missed very often as part of a lotto program. It's one that is easily overlooked. So if you do have a Lotto program in your facilities, please make sure that your facilities know that they need to do these periodic inspections, because it is one that is easily overlooked and missed, and one that we know Cal OSHA will always look for, and it is critical for determining the effectiveness of those programs and those procedures in particular. So this is one, again, I would go back to making sure you kind of have your tracker in place or something in place that is triggering to you or to your on the ground team that these inspections need to be done in the cadence at which they need to be done at. And one of the things that also gets lost in the lockout tagout is the employer shall certify that the periodic inspections have been performed. So even though you may do them, they are not certified. And that is the number one document Cal OSHA is going to come in and ask for, but also helps you to ensure that the effectiveness of these procedures really has been done by those, has been reviewed by those people on the ground that are doing them, that you have that certification. And that's going to include identifying the machine or equipment on which the hazardous energy control procedure was being utilized, date of inspection, employees included in the inspection, and person performing the inspection. So certainly want to make sure that you do that. And in California, our Lotto rule is a little different than the Fed rule when it comes to outside personnel. So in California, know that any outside personnel that are coming in to service your machinery, they are required to use the on-site employer's procedures, so specific procedures. So for that reason, it's even more important that you're doing these periodic inspections of those procedures, because it's not only things that are for your employees, but outside personnel coming in that have to perform lotto on that equipment that will be, they'll be using your procedures as well. And then we talked about workplace violence prevention several times here, but it also requires procedures to identify and evaluate workplace violence hazards. And that includes scheduled periodic inspections to identify those hazards. And those inspections shall be conducted when the plan is first established, after each workplace violence incident, and whenever an employer is made aware of new or previously unrecognized hazard. So as you can see, that language tracks very, very closely to the IIPP language when it comes to when periodic inspections must be performed. And so you can certainly see the trend from Cal OSHA's perspective of when they are expecting employers to be evaluating hazards on the workplace, to determine if all of those have been identified at the site. And here, kind of the addition is after each workplace violence incident. So it's really, again, these are already built into these regulations. So take them as an opportunity to really push on whether or not your procedures and your program and your plans are effective. We all know that not everything can be prevented. I'm not sure Cal OSHA would agree with that statement, but practically speaking, we know that. But certainly taking the opportunity to evaluate this stuff, you have to already, but ensuring that the folks that you have doing that really understand that it's not a check the box activity, that it's really meant to ensure that what we have in place is working, operational, and effective. And records of workplace violence hazards, identification, evaluation, and correction shall be created and maintained for the minimum of 5 years. This is a longer period than we see under the IIPP, which is a 1 year retention. This is 5 years, but it's the same thing. We are maintaining records of the identification, evaluation, and correction. And that correction, again, is where I see a lot of employers kind of drop the ball, because they may, when they identify the hazard and they make their evaluation, that's all documented, and then nobody goes back to include what the corrective activity was, because maybe that was several months later when that was completed, and that's not included in the documentation. But the requirement is that it is. And, one of the things that we recommend as part of identifying, trends of things where you may be able to improve your safety program is reviewing your inspection checklists, at the end of the year, to see, was there a trend in what was identified and what was corrected. So having, not only from a compliance standpoint, having really great documentation is important, but it's also really important from reviewing your programs at the end of the year or whenever you may do it, and determining, are my programs effective, by looking at these documentation. So we're also going to talk a little bit about the benefits and risks of incident investigations and audits. In California, under the IIPP, we are required to do incident investigations. That's part, or to have procedures to do so. You may or may not want to do that under privilege, depending on the incident. For very significant incidents, a lot of our clients, we do work with them to do those privileged investigations. And that is a very important part of identifying hazards, opportunities for the safety program to improve, and limiting the liability that you have with Cal OSHA. Because, as some of you may know, when you may do a great investigation report, you may do a great audit report, and it's not privileged, and you turn it over to Cal OSHA, and it's essentially a roadmap for them to cite you. And of course, doing those things are incredibly important to strengthening your safety program, but audits under privilege and investigations under privilege may help you limit your exposure. So some additional advantages: you're IDing the cause of the incident to avoid similar incidents, IDing causes that may be beyond your control, IDing and eliminating hazards, demonstrating the effectiveness of the program. So if there are things that occurred that that are the root cause of the incident that didn't have to do with the effectiveness of the program, you now have documentation of that. Exposes potential deficiencies in the process or equipment, and helps to reduce injury rates and workers' compensation costs. So here's some, ways that if you are not doing your investigations or your audits correctly, or maybe not doing them under privilege, some of the potential downsides of that. There can be workers' compensation repercussions. There could be, if the incident spurs a criminal prosecution, and it could provide information or evidence of that. And just as a side note, here in California, where we have the Bureau of Investigation, which is their job to, it's a unit within Cal OSHA, and it's their job to review certain incidents to determine if there's the potential of criminal conduct. And we have seen that unit become increasingly more aggressive in the past couple months. So certainly this second column, if you have a significant event, something you want to keep in mind, and certainly want to determine whether or not you want to do that investigation or audit under privilege. third-party litigation, whether that be because it's outside of the workers' comp exclusivity bar or some other reason, ensuring that we're not providing evidence for that. And of course, any kind of negative media reporting. So benefits of doing the privilege investigation reports and audits, you get to the opportunity to make very robust, meaningful reports without it coming back to haunt you. You know, you can put in all of the things that you may be reluctant to put in a report because a non-privileged report, because if you have to turn it over to Cal OSHA or another entity, you don't want to call out certain things. It also gives you the ability to engage in a valuable discussion and back and forth internally without the concern of those communications being discoverable. So we certainly find that privileged investigations and audits are a really great way to strengthen your safety program and to help really push on the effectiveness of your program. And then lastly, I won't spend too much time on this because I think that Andrea covered it in her presentation, but the last piece of program effectiveness review is, of course, reviewing your OSHA documents for those trends. So your 300 logs, the increases in injuries, are there correlations with that? Employee disciplinary records. If we're seeing consistent discipline in certain areas, is that an indicator that maybe it's an effective training or an ineffective procedures? If employees are consistently not doing it right, or are we ineffective in our enforcement of, it's not a procedure or a training issue, it's a we're not enforcing our safety program correctly. And that may be just as important component of ensuring the effectiveness of your safety program. Again, you can have the most beautifully written programs, you can have done the most beautifully, thorough audits, have everything corrected, but if you're not enforcing your safety program, that is going to be a huge deficiency in its effectiveness. And then, of course, complaints that may show areas of improvement, of course, if we're seeing multiple complaints in a particular area. And then always following through on corrective actions and measures, making sure that we're documenting, document the reasons that we may not take a corrective action, why we choose to take one over the other, and updating those inspection checklists, updating procedures and training to correlate with what we have identified. So we've identified the hazard and making sure everything is updated accordingly. So with that, we are exactly at an hour. Thank you for joining us today. We will send around the slides and a recording of this. You'll get an email probably early next week with this. If you haven't signed up, we have continue with our webinar series. You can sign up for it on our website or email any of us. Our blog series, special services, but really important, we have a in-person Cal OSHA and Labor and Employment Summit in October in Berkeley and Pasadena. We'd love to see you all in person. We'd love to discuss anything and everything with you in person. So please check that out. We think it's great programs, and thank you for joining us.